Hi there, Paul. A long time ago in a faraway land, two best friends fell in love with the same young woman. They had met the young woman one afternoon as they set up booby traps for their hunts in the forest, and as the young gatherer picked fruit and stacked it into her basket. The two young men had been sitting underneath a tree, hoping for a deer or a rabbit to pass by so they could take meat home when they heard the breaking of twigs and dry leaves underfoot. Excited it was game, they had quietly looked around to see who it was. But it was a beautiful ebony-skinned young woman who sidestepped their traps and went to a nearby mutamba tree to give it a good shake before she stooped to pick the fruit. But that first glance at her had the two young men intake breath so sharply and at the same moment. Their hearts had beat in tandem with excitement, and swallowing at the same time, they had looked at each other and nodded. Ngoni, one of the young men, was the first to whisper after they had watched the young woman long enough. Friend, I have found the woman I will take home to my parents. Look at her. Just look at her. Even my parents will be proud of my choice. Kuda, the other young man, had simply nodded and sighed. Of course Ngoni would get the young woman. He had no chance with her. So he had laughed despite the ache in his heart that he had again lost a girl to his friend. Of course, my friend, Kuda said, this one seems like a great choice. Songoni stood and wiped the grass and twigs off his pants before he cleared his throat and called out to the young woman. Oh, beautiful day that I come to look for a rabbit or a deer, and yet I find the most beautiful treasure sitting beside my trap. Tsitsi, the young woman, was startled, and the damba fruit that she had broken had slipped out of her hands. A part of her wanted to grab the basket on the ground and run, but the young man who stood opposite her was lithe, and he would outrun her should he wish to. So she stood and stared at him and waited. Ngoni, seeing the fear that was in the young woman's eyes, smiled and held up his hands. I did not mean to startle you. It is just that when I saw you, I couldn't resist the urge to talk to you. Who knows whether I shall see someone like you again? Again Tutsi did not answer and simply stared at him, so he said again, Do you mind if I help you? That is such a big haul of fruits I doubt you'll be able to carry it all on your own. And it will be a pity if you were to leave so much fruit lying around. So she nodded and was startled again when another young man emerged from behind the tree, and the two of them helped her pack and filled their own backpacks and accompanied her to a fruit stall with the largest haul she had ever carried. When they arrived, Ngoni had asked her if he would ever see her again, and she had agreed, although she was a bit hesitant. She had never courted a man before, and a part of her feared all men, what with the abuse she had seen her mother suffer within her marriage. And so a part of her hoped that he would not turn up, and she would be left alone, and she could continue with her quiet, unbothered gathering life, with no young man to meet and court and have expectations for. But what Tsitsi had not known was that there was another young man who had also taken a liking to her. Kudai had not been able to take his eyes off the young woman as they gathered fruit, and every glance he could chance, he would peep at her. His heart had broken though when the young woman had barely acknowledged his presence and had instead spent all the time responding to Ngoni. And as they had walked back to her stall, Kudai had decided not to intrude and walked behind the two of them as he listened to Ngoni charm the young woman. For Kuda, this was not new. Ngoni had always begged all the beautiful girls that they met, and effortlessly so, even though his interest lasted only a week. He was a talker and had a way with words. He could make girls laugh, and he always found a topic that was interesting to them. And the young women also fell easily in love with him, despite the fact that Ngoni soon grew bored and would move to the next conquest. Kuda, however, could not talk to women folk. Even when he was a boy, whenever they had played mahumbwe or nodo with the other girls in the village, Kuda would retreat into a corner and watch others play. And his friends would mercilessly tease him, sending their sisters and girl cousins to ask him if he wanted water or edowe or some takura. Kuda would not respond as his body would break into shingles and his tongue would retract and his head swim until the girl became a confused blur before him that would disappear further and further away as the girl would give up and return to her friends who would be bursting with laughter. Onlingoni had never laughed at him and would sometimes say to his friend, "Pretend I'm a girl, talk to me." And all the world's eloquence would pour out of Kuda's mouth until Ngoni was satisfied his friend was better and would bring another girl before him, to which Kuda's tongue would curl into his tonsils and disappear. Kuda's situation did not improve even as they got older. This one and his fear of women will never marry. People would laugh as his voice deepened and the stubble on his chin grew to his throat, and his older cousins began to marry one by one. "At least you will not have to pay bride price from the kettle crow," the cousins laughed as they talked to their grandmother, and Kudai had resigned himself to a bachelor's life until he met Tsitsi. Yes, she was beautiful, he admitted to himself as he walked behind her and Goni, but it was not her beauty that had mesmerized him. It was her aura, which felt like a warm hug and which enveloped him close to her and made him feel as if he had arrived in paradise. It was a laughter which carried meaning and intent, yet sounded as quiet as a calm river, and it was a demeanor that spoke of strength born from an unspoken adversity and vulnerability from unspoken traumas. Behind the two of them, he tested his tongue to see if it would open, and he whispered to himself, "So beautiful," and liked what he heard. Should she turn back now? He told himself, "I will not disappoint myself by stuttering." Yet she had not seen him, let alone spoken to him, except a brief thank you as he placed a backpack of fruit at her feet. And later, as he and Ngoni rushed back to the forest again to check on their booby traps, Ngoni had spoken. "Did you see her, my friend?" he asked again, and did not wait for an answer. "She is gorgeous, isn't she? Friend, this is the one I am marrying now. I will have to inform my father as soon as I know where she is from, so that the Roora is not delayed and I make her mine soon." "Your friend? I have found the one I want now." Kunai had pestered all the strength in his body into a smile, and with a light-hearted fist, palmed his friend in the back and said, "I am happy for you, my friend. Please do not destroy this with your philandering." Ngoni burst out laughing. "Those days are over, friend. My father has said I should start acting like a man, and marrying her would make me a real man." "Friend," he laughed, now patting Kuda in the back, "I will even destroy all my father's kettle pens for this one year. You watch." Kuda forced out a laugh. He knew indeed that Ngoni's father had cattle too innumerable to count, and that gave his friend another advantage. For what right-thinking woman would refuse a wealthy man who could take care of her and their future children? Kuda now knew that the only woman he had fallen for would never choose him. And when Ngoni and Tsitsi's courtship took off, Kuda knew he had to quickly extinguish the flame of longing that had stirred in his heart. Now, as was their culture's custom, a relationship between a young man and a young woman had to be communicated to the young woman's aunt before the relationship could be cemented. The aunt would be there to stand in as the elder to chaperone the relationship to ensure that both parties behaved and no shame would be brought to either family. But despite the custom, many a young couple would meet for secret rendezvous and only announce their relationship when they were both sure of marriage. "I am not sure I want to marry," Tsitsi told Ngoni in the first days of their courtship. "If I tell my aunt, then we will be forced to have an early marriage, of which I am not ready yet." They were sitting on a rock in the forest, not very far from where they had first met, and Ngoni had broken a damba fruit for her. "But that does not mean I do not fear coming here into the forest to meet with you," Tsitsi had continued. "The last thing I would like to do is to bring shame to my family." I understand, Goni responded, which is why I will bring my friend Kudai here with us. I know it's unorthodox, having a male chaperone, but I pledge on his honor to never bring shame to your family. Kudai had not said anything, of course, tongue-tied as he was, but he had of course nodded to show his acquiescence of the duty. As Ngoni and Tsitsi could not meet publicly, Kuda was the go-between. Ngoni would send his best friend with a gold coin to the market, and while there, Kuda would peruse the food and artifacts around the stalls, waiting for his eyes to connect with Tsitsi's, and when they did, air would coagulate in his throat and he would temporarily lose his mind, but he would quickly remember where he was and then give the young woman an imperceptible nod towards the forest. Once she left, Kuda would follow her, walking at least 5 steps behind her to avoid conversation with her and also to keep her safe in the forest. In those moments, he felt like a herder leading his best cow to the slaughterhouse, and his heart would ache sorely. As they walked, 1,000 words would swirl in his mind about how beautiful she was, about how he wanted to be her friend, about how much his heart filled with longing whenever he saw her, but none of the words found the way to his tongue. Instead, he would watch her as she walked ahead of him, from the fine hairs at the base of her neck to the smooth heels that barely touched the ground as she walked. It was not just any walk, it was a glide, as though her heels were afraid to stain the ground. And when they finally got to Ngoni, Kuda would silently excuse himself and go and sit on another rock, facing the direction they faced, and giving them his union. But still, he could not escape her, her voice rustling like the leaves in the gentle afternoon breeze, and its soft echoes filling him with both warmth and yearning. Her presence in the vicinity making the summer days cooler, and her nervous, almost unfinished laugh trilling and merging with the other forest sounds. He knew she could never be his, but still he could not help himself thinking about her all the time. Tsitsi, however, had learned very early to be comfortable around the young man who accompanied her to her endeavors with her suitor. She had of course learned from Goni that he was shy around beautiful girls, and a part of her was amused and would try to talk to him as they walked, but he only ever gave her one-word answers. Fine, to hear how I use. Yes, to hear it's a fine day. Great to hear how's work these days. And each time they walked into the forest, curiosity would grip her, and she would ask what he did for a living, who his parents were, and what his aspirations for the future were. But he would never break out of character and still give answers like nothing when asked of his aspirations, and gone when asked of his parentage, that Tsitsi eventually sighed and stopped asking him questions. She asked Ngoni though, and he told her that Kuda's parents had passed when he was a baby, and he was raised by his widowed grandmother. He wants to join the King's Advisory Council, though, Ngoni explains, so he spends his mornings with the elders learning kingdom law and running errands for the council. Will he be able to speak though once he is in the council? Will you talk to the king and give him advice? Tsitsi joked. He is learning, Ngoni told her. Everyone in the council reckons he is really smart, so that might be a plus for him. And Tsitsi had nodded. There was something about Kuda too that made him special for her, and Tsitsi could not figure out why. Yes, she might not have engaged in as many conversations with him, but she considered that he was smart and very observant. Maybe it was his humility, or his authenticity, or his lack of pretense, but he really was a special person. She did not know though when or how she came to learn that he liked her, but she had begun noticing how his eyes never met his, but when she was not looking, she would feel his eyes on her, studying her. Whenever she looked up at him, however, he would quickly look away. She knew too that he listened to her when she spoke, and his eyes would spark genuine interest in whatever she was speaking about, although he hardly spoke back to her or responded. But what she found cute was his respect. Not once had he made her feel unsafe with him. Not once had he physically projected those feelings to her. Not once had he even tried to create tension between her and Gwani. He respected his friend in their friendship, and he respected Tsitsi too, and that made her feel safe around him. And time soon passed, and Ngoni and Tsitsi's love blossomed, and soon enough, her courtship with Ngoni was announced together with the impending Ro'ora dates. A part of her remained apprehensive of marriage, of love, but she knew she had come to feel for Ngoni deeply, and in her heart, he seemed like a good man and was nothing at all like her father. But Tsitsi's relationship with Ngoni was made worse by her family, for as immediately as Tsitsi's aunt Tete had been approached by Ngoni and made aware of his interest and eventual intention to marry, Tete had rushed to tell her brother, Tsitsi's father. Tsitsi's father's eyes had grown bigger with each revelation from his sister. "You mean Ngoni, the cattle farmer's son?" Tete nodded excitedly. "Him exactly," she said. "Oh, my child will bring us great fortune," Tsitsi's father laughed, standing up to do a celebratory jig and knocking down a cup of beers in the process. "All those cows will fill my pen. Ah, my sister," he pulled Tete up to dance. "What great fortune this girl has brought us. At least she has been useful for once. You know how useless all these girl children I have can be." They both laughed, with Tete adding, "It is because of that lazy first wife of yours who refused to take portions for sons. But at least now you will have some solace with the cows, and the girl too will be out of your hands." And they both laughed. After her family had learnt of the impending marriage, Tsitsi had realized there was nothing to do about her apprehensions. She was going to be a wife now, and she just hoped he would be kind to her. And she hoped that the lessons her mother had given her on being a good wife would work, considering that her mother had not had the greatest of luck. Tsitsi and Ngoni's Ro'ora ceremony was unprecedented, as Ngoni's family opened their cattle pens and offered bride price to the bride's family to an extent that even Tsitsi's father, who was greedy, said, "No, that's enough for our daughter. We want to leave something for relations." But still the ceremony had the kingdom abuzz. Kuda, who had been the chief negotiator for the bride price, had almost cried later that afternoon when negotiations were over and the beautiful wife was called in. She walked in with a tentative smile as the room ululated and whistled, then went to sit beside her new husband, who beamed with pride. By the time Kuda looked away, he had seen the newlyweds' hands slip into each other, and his already so heart-traveled to lodge right up into his throat. He knew he would never fall for a woman like this again. But Tsitsi and Ngoni's marriage would only last for a few years, as tragedy would strike in their home, leaving the heavily pregnant Tsitsi alone and scared. A dispute had arisen between Tsitsi's kingdom and their neighbors over ownership of the river that divided the two territories, with both kingdoms claiming that they had the right to own the river, as most of the tributaries flowed from their regions. But the dispute, which had started off small and inconsequential, soon grew bigger and bigger, with accusations of theft of mines, livestock, and beautiful women being thrown around the kingdoms. And as the dispute grew, so too was a call of arms instituted until all young virile men were called, and so too had Ngoni gone. A poisoned arrow, however, had scratched his bicep as it went to lodge on a tree, and Ngoni had quickly swiped his hand and gone back to fighting. But he had not lasted for more than 10 heartbeats, for he had begun to feel weak. He tried to call out to his colleagues, but his voice was no longer coming out. He stood for a long moment as people rushed around him, holding his heart which beat like the drum of a drunk drummer, rhythmless and hollow. Then his legs wobbled, and he tried to right himself, but a force stronger than him was pressing him down, and he was too tired to fight him, until in the end he sighed his last sigh and gave up, falling to the ground that would now house him forever. Sati was inconsolable. When the news of his demise had preceded the arrival of his corpse, she had laughed, because there was no way her ancestors would bless her with a man who had shown her nothing but adoration and care, and then take him before the arrival of their first child. But when the lifeless body had been transported into the yard, she had hurled herself to the ground, pregnant belly and all, and had wanted to pummel the earth over and over again had people not held her back. Why, she had asked no one. Why him? Of all the men who had gone to the forest, why him? What crime had he committed that had angered the ancestors to the point of no forgiveness? But he was gone, and the fairy tale was over. Kuda too had been devastated by his friend's passing. He had recently joined the king's advisory council, and he had been the one to advise the king about the unnecessity of the war. Look, he told the king and the rest of the council, this matter can be solved without using swords and arrows. We can divide the waters. They will control trade upriver. We will control trade downriver. There is no need to send our skilled men into a war that can be won with words. But the rest of the council had laughed. He is new to these things, they said. He does not know that a kingdom can only assert its power with its military strength and not over a cup of beer between kings. Should we speak and not fight, they will mock us and find ways of provoking us. No, a matter between kingdoms is solved with an arrow and with force. And yet, that had cost him his friend. But the heartbreak he had felt when he learnt of Ngoni's demise was nothing compared to how his soul crushed when he arrived at Tsitsi's house to pass condolences. Mucus and tears free-falled across her face with nothing to stem them. Her hair, which had always been perfectly coiffed, was now matted, likely from rolling on the ground, and her heavy, pregnant stomach stood proudly, defiantly, as though mocking the sorrow around her. When he took her arms and used to say, I am sorry, the words stuck in his throat despite the fact that he was getting better at speaking with people. He could see her eyes on him, but he knew she did not see him. Her pain was too tangible for him, but he knew he could not lift it and carry it away. It would be hers to carry until she could finally shed it off herself, and he knew that it would take a long time for her to forget, to heal. So in the end, he said the longest sentences he had ever said to her. Know that I am always here for you. Should you need anything, just call on me at any time. I will help take care of the baby and you for as long as I shall live, because Ngoni would have done the same for me. Kuda kept his promise, passing by Tsitsi's home every evening from work to ask how she was, to check if the cows had been properly locked in, to check the strength of the enclosures, to ensure the hyenas would not visit, and to bring her fresh fruit and vegetables from the market as she was becoming increasingly incapacitated by the pregnancy. And when, a moon after Ngoni's burial, a son was born, Kuda had led the god-slaughtering process to welcome the new child into the home, a tradition usually reserved for the father. He also brought swaddles and skins for the baby and more fruit for the new mother. Thank you, Tsitsi said, a week after the baby was born, her voice groggy from grief and from lack of sleep. They were sitting in a lounge, and Tsitsi had just finished breastfeeding. I don't know how I would have survived through this without you. Not with my parents and Ngoni's parents fighting and disagreeing over his estate. You are God-sent. What is happening between them? Ngoni asked, outstretching his arms for the now birth baby. Tsitsi sighed and shook her head. My father says that it is not right for a young woman and a young mother to stay alone in this large homestead. He says that he and his 3 wives and their children can shift and move and come to stay here and make this their home. But Ngoni's family is saying that is a breach of culture, as no father-in-law lords over his son-in-law's home, whether the son-in-law is departed or not. So they say either I leave to go back to my parents' home or my family does not come here at all. Then my father threatens to disown me when I tell him of the state of affairs. Kuda, all I want to do is think of the good moments I shared with my husband and spend time with my child. I do not want to be part of this additional circus. Kuda nodded and said, I understand. He rocked the baby for a while as he searched for the least number of words to say as he then asked the next question. But what about you? Do you want to go back home or stay here? I am not going back home, Tsitsi said emphatically. Never. And I would take my family if it was just my mother and your 2 other daughters, not the whole lot of them. So you want to stay? Kuda asked. Tsitsi nodded, and Kuda told her that if the matter continued without any resolution, she would have to let him know so that he could help solve the matter at the royal court. Of course, the matter escalated to the royal court, what with Tsitsi's father's belligerence. Despite Ngoni's family's insistence that he could not move in, he had, with his youngest wife and their 2 younger children. I can't leave my daughter alone at the mercy of the in-laws. We know that after a man dies, his properties becomes the wife's. These people just want to keep controlling my daughter so they have access to her wealth. But now they will see me. I will not let my daughter be bullied, ever. What startled Tsitsi, even as he said this, was the number of times he had called her my daughter. The men who had forever treated them like mistakes, like unworthy of becoming a part of society, calling her my daughter. But there was nothing she could do about preventing him from moving in. He was older. He was stronger. She was the child, the daughter, and if she chased him away, she knew people would accuse her of being disrespectful and ungrateful, for children were supposed to look after their parents in the parents' old age. But Tsitsi's father had only been in the home for a week before Tsitsi had decided she had had enough with him. He had started again with the assault, and in the depths of the night, she and her newborn would be awoken by her stepmother's chilly screams accompanied by thousand thwacks and shouts of, "Who do you think you are?" And in the morning, the young wife who had been taken to bear sons after the 2 older wives had failed would not meet Tsitsi's eye, even though Tsitsi could see the welts and the swellings on her body. The man was unstoppable too, for his assaults and insults had no boundaries. When Ngoni's family had learned that he had moved in, despite their strong warnings to him not to, they had then sent 2 uncles to talk to him. The 2 uncles had not said a word, for as soon as they had entered the homestead, Tsitsi's father had untied the whip that also served as a belt from his waist and lashed it once onto the ground as a warning before he unleashed it on the uncles, who turned and fled, one leaving his sandal behind as evidence of their presence. Tsitsi had learned later that he had chased them right to their homesteads, where he had threatened them with even more wrath should he ever see their behinds again. But it was the debtors who were Tsitsi's snapping point. The first one came and told her that her father owed him 2 goats and the debt was over 3 years old. Tiredly, Tsitsi had sent her head boy to get 2 goats from the pen and paid off the debt. Then another came, and another, and another. They all came in when her father was not around, when he was most likely at the Ndari drinking beer, and they would state their claim, and Tsitsi would pay until she was tired. "I am finishing the wealth that my husband left my son and I," she told Kuda, who had come after she had sent a pleading message to him. "I know you told me that I should call if I ever needed help. I need help now. Please help me take the matter to the court." Kuda nodded and said, "Well, as luck would have it, he already has another court case. Ngoni's uncles opened a case against him for assault, so you can stand and testify against him in court and perhaps have him barred from taking liberties in your home. So off to court they went, and the father was cautioned against his violence towards his wives and neighbors, and was told to pay for his own debts, and was ordered to return to his own home, although he could return to Tsitsi's by invitation. And after the sentencing, he had glared at Tsitsi, and she had shivered, knowing that it would be a mother who would pay the price of the sentence with the fists and the whip. When Kuda came to visit later that afternoon, he asked her, "Are you satisfied with the judgment?" Tsitsi nodded even though she still looked pensive. Then she said, "My father is unpredictable, you know. You never know with him. I think he might come back tonight." She sighed, then said, "A part of me wishes I'd never testified against him in court." Kuda could see the fear in her eyes, and he had seen the fury in the man's face in court earlier. He could only wonder what could happen to Tsitsi if the man turned up. So he asked her quietly, "Do you have anywhere to go in the meantime?" She shook her head and he asked again, "Do you want me to stay in the other hut tonight?" Tsitsi's nod was quick and full of eager relief, but then she said, "You can't put a stop to your routines for my father. I wouldn't want that." Kuda laughed and said, "Ngoni was my brother and friend. He would have wanted you protected. He would have wanted me to protect you, and I can't leave you here alone, especially when you are this scared." So she had agreed, and Kuda settled in the hut next to hers. Except he did not settle. How could he when he had seen her again so much in the last months? After Tsitsi's marriage to Ngoni, Kuda had willed himself to forget her. He had invested in learning how to communicate. He had invested in becoming an advisor. And in their year of marriage, he had hardly visited Ngoni in his marital home, meeting him instead in the forest for their favorite hunting pastime, and a part of him had healed. But now, spending time with her, seeing her so sad and vulnerable, and watching her fight battles alone, his heart was stirring again. He wanted to be with her again. He wanted to hug her, to protect her, to shield her from everything. And she was free now, wasn't she? She was single now. But even as he thought that, his heart froze. She was single because his friend was gone. Her singleness meant that the boy and the man he had loved and cherished like a brother would never be seen again. And yet here he was, shamelessly pining after his best friend's wife. What kind of man was he? What kind of friend was he? He spent the night pacing up and down the length of the hut, checking to see if there were any intruders, but mostly trying to still his aching heart. And when morning came, it dawned with a resolution in his heart. He would never see her again. He would ask the king to make him part of the delegation that was going to negotiate peace with their belligerent neighbors. And once he was away, he would not torment his heart so. The king agreed, saying, "We should have listened to you from the beginning. You have an astute mind, and I hope you will help in advocating and preserving peace in our land." Later that afternoon, he returned with the news to Tsitsi's home. For a long moment, she looked at him, heartbroken, and said, "I feel as though I am losing people every other day. Ngoni, my father, as wicked as he is, the rest of my family, and now you." The word sliced through Kuda's brain, and he was tempted to say, "I will stay." But he knew that would only break his fragile heart further, so instead he said, "I will ask some of the king's guards to check on you now and then. If there are any challenges, tell them. They will know how to reach me. I will come back to assist you. But in the meantime, take care of yourself and the young man here." And playfully pulling the baby's cheeks, he bade Tsitsi farewell and stepped out before breathing a large sigh. And for 2 years, Kuda kept away. He took assignments that kept him out of the kingdom, and seeing as his communication skills had greatly improved, he had become one of the kingdom's chief negotiators. From the years of quietness, he had learnt listening and patience, which allowed him to expertly craft his response responses that the king had made him the head of foreign affairs. His diplomatic skills were now contributing to peace within his kingdom, and that made his heart feel at ease. He could not forget Tsitsi though, for try as he might, her image hovered above his head, and she was all he thought of. But absence helped. Of course he heard of her from the guards he asked, and they told her she was doing okay, and he did not bother to ask anything more. The less he knew, the better. Yet Tsitsi was struggling. Her father had completely alienated her from the rest of her family. He told us that you disrespected him by speaking about him in court. Her younger sister, who had snuck upon her one afternoon for a secret visit, said. He said that if anyone dares try to get in touch with you, then he would not hesitate with the whip. He said you are not his daughter anymore, but a stranger to us. And after she had told Tsitsi, the young woman had surreptitiously checked outside the gate to see if someone was watching before waving hastily and disappearing. So Tsitsi had only seen her family from a distance for over 2 years. She sometimes saw her mother, her own biological mother, in the market or in the streets, but the woman would cast her gaze away, and the two of them would pass each other like the sun and the moon, sharing the same space, but hardly acknowledging each other. It hurt Tsitsi that her mother had never held her son. It hurt Tsitsi too that Nkoni's family had moved on with their lives and left her to fend for herself. She was so lonely, she knew, and yet there was nothing to do but be strong for her child. She would, however, have appreciated her loneliness better had her father left her completely alone. But as though he was hell-bent on crippling her totally, the men had taken to breaking into her pens and hiding a cow here, a goat there, and a sheep somewhere. The theft had gone on for a while. No matter how many times she would tell the head boy to securely lock the pens before he left for his home. In the mornings, she would find a part of the enclosure struck down and another animal missing. So she had tried to catch the thief one evening, standing by her window all night, holding an axe in her hands and hoping the baby would not wake to startle the thief. And sometime in the middle of the night, she had seen his silhouette, the frame of a small man sneaking into a homestead, looking around, then tiptoeing to the pens where with an axe he broke a panel of the enclosure, then headed 2 goats out, tiptoeing with them out of the homestead. She had slumped to the ground, anger and pain swirling for dominance in her heart, until she finally gave in to the pain. Reporting him again would probably lead him to the dungeons, and he would likely never see the light of day again. But was it this that she wanted for herself? No, she did not, and she was too tired to fight. Her child was going to be the only reason she fought. The very next day, Tsitsi retrieved the baskets she had pegged when she got married. She was a gatherer after all, and she had a child to feed. So tying her baby to her back and placing her basket atop her head, she had begun a journey to her familiar Jones, carefully retracing her steps to the trees she had known produced the best fruit. And so she returned to her stall by the market, and the hustle and bustle of customers in the market itself made her feel better. But once in a while, in the forest, she would visit her old Jones and the places she had been to with her husband, and every time she would feel the pinch of tears in her eyes, and she would tell the young boy on her back, "This is where your father and I met, Nana. This is where we fell in love. I wish you had known him. I knew you two would have loved each other, but it is well." And it was on such a day as she sat by the rock that she had once sat on with her husband, accepting the dumba fruit he had broken for her, laughing at his jokes and listening to him explaining endless story after endless story, that she heard something crackle, and she leapt up, her heart in her throat, hoping it was not a wild animal, as she had not carried a weapon with her. And as she turned, her heart righted, and she laughed, looking at the familiar stranger who stood before her. "You startled me," she said, laughing. "I am so glad it is just you." Kudai had not expected to find her here. He had been back in the kingdom for 2 days, and a restlessness had led him to the place where he had once laid traps with his friend. He needed a distraction, something to do to get away from his ever-busy mind. He was doing great at his job, and the king was pleased with him that he had rewarded him greatly, and he was now a man of means. But something was nagging him, his lack of a marital partner. It was now the topic of conversation around him. "When will you marry?" the man he sat with in the advisory council asked. "In all this traveling, you must have met at least one young woman you liked. So when will you do the right thing?" And even the king, in less overt ways, had said, "A man is respected through the family he creates." The pressure on him to marry was mounting, and every other time he was in the kingdom, he was being invited to dine with a family who had an unmarried daughter. There were plenty of beautiful women in the kingdom, he knew, but there was not one that he liked enough to try and marry. But when he had arrived from another diplomatic trip 2 days earlier, the king had called him aside. After congratulating the younger man for the success of the trip, the king had then said, "There is talk around the kingdom that someone who cannot start a family is in no position to counsel the king. My son, I would hate to lose you should this notion be tabled in the council, which is why I want to ask you if you need my help. Is there perhaps anyone in this kingdom or another kingdom that you like, but you are having difficulty approaching, whom you would want royal assistance with?" Of course, Kudai had wanted to respond. There is Ngoni's wife, but he knew that was unacceptable. She was a married woman, even though her husband had passed, and that meant she was touched and could not be married by a man marrying for the first time. So scratching his head, he had said, "Let me think about it, my king. I will be back with a response in a week." And yet for the past 2 days he had hardly slept, wondering who he would choose, as all the young women's faces in his mind turned to one big blur. These thoughts were uppermost in his mind as he walked into the forest that for a second after he saw Tsitsi sitting on a rock he had wanted to laugh. Were the ancestors telling him something? A part of him had wanted to quietly retreat and continue on his quest to forget her, and yet his heart shook its head and led him closer and closer to her until they were standing face to face. "I am sorry," he said, looking over at the beautiful face he had tried so hard to forget and yet had not. "I didn't mean to startle you. I didn't realize you would be here." She smiled ruefully and said, "It's okay." Then she looked around the forest before turning to him and saying, "I come here to feel his presence. Sometimes I feel he is here, that his spirit resides here with me. I just come to reconnect with him sometimes." It was Kuda's turn to smile ruefully as he said, "You miss him?" She nodded. "Not as much as I did back then, but I do wonder what life would have been had he still been around." They were both quiet for a while, then Susie turned to look at him properly as though she was seeing him for the first time. "But you, stranger, where have you been? You forgot all about us in your important job?" Koda smiled and said meaningfully, "I would never forget you if I tried." Then seeing the quizzical eyebrow that Susie had raised, he finished, "How have you been? And the boy here has grown. How has everything been?" Tsitsi smiled tightly, then said, "Everything is fine." Then she saw Kuda's gaze falling on the basket full of fruit, and she sighed, deciding to tell him everything. "I had to go back to selling. It helps sustain my son and I, and besides, being around other women in the marketplace helps me forget my challenges." Kuda nodded. Then in his low voice he said, "I am glad that you have the market community to help you during these times." A part of his heart was sore though. What kind of friend was he that he had not helped to look after the welfare of his only friend's family? Why had he not reached out? Stupid pride? A silly crush? Was that all worth it to alienate the family of someone he had loved so? Anguished, he walked over to the rock and sat, burying his head in his palms and saying, "I am sorry." His voice came out muffled. All this could have been prevented if I had been around, if I had made an effort to care. Please forgive me. It's not your fault, Tsitsi said, coming to sit beside him, and I do not blame you for leaving. You have a life too, and you deserve to leave it. But Kuda shook his head, then said, No, I am a wretched friend. I wish I could have done better. Tsitsi did not respond. Instead, she reached for his hand and petted it. He watched the joint of their hands and he could not help but shiver excitedly. Yet he did not say anything. She did not say anything too, and for the longest time they sat like that, silent, each immersed in their own thoughts. Kuda was the first to break the silence, to voice out his thoughts, for he turned to look at her and said, I have a solution for all this. You can't go through all this alone, at least not while I am here and I am alive. He was quiet again, searching for the words to say next in his mind and hoping they would land softly. Then in an exhale of breath he said, Let us marry. Tsitsi wrenched her hand out of his, then leapt up again and stood from a distance, watching him. Then softly she said, You can't be serious, Kudam. But I am, he said, and a part of him longed to tell her why. He wanted to tell her that he had been in love with her from the first moment they had met. He wanted to lose all restraint and let her know, but her expression was one of disbelief, and he knew he had to walk carefully from here on. He was an expert negotiator after all, and he needed all the expertise in the world to help him. So instead of pouring his feelings, he told her of the conversation he had had with the king and his desire to settle down immediately. I have not met anyone I want to marry, he said as he finished, and yet the king has threatened that he will find a wife for me. Don't you think that if perhaps we marry, I get to take care of you and your child, and you get to give me respectability? Respectability? Tsitsi scoffed. What respectability will you gain when you, who has never been married before, marries me, a widow, a touched woman? Do you realize that people will talk, will laugh, and you will lose everything you have worked so hard to build? And besides, you were my husband's friend. I see you as his brother, and I don't see myself marrying you. Kuda smiled, then said, You say you see me as Ngoni's brother, which I agree I am, and now I want you to remind you of our culture. When a man passes, his brothers are eligible to marry his wife under the custom of Kugaranaka. I know I am not his blood brother, but Ngoni and I were friends. At that moment, Nguda realized that Tsitsi had already opened her mouth to interject, so he was quicker and said, I am not expecting a response from you now, but I do not have much time myself. I shall visit you towards the end of the week, and whatever you will have decided, I will take your response. For now, let us go home, and I'll let you think about it. The thoughts were uppermost in Tsitsi's head all week long. How could she marry her late husband's best friend? What did that make her? What would people think of her? Hopping from one friend to the next, society would label her as loose, as a woman with no morals. She could already see people's noses crunched in disdain as she walked past. She could already hear their judgmental whispers and talks, and she knew she would be ostracized even further. But wasn't she already ostracized? Wasn't she already lonely? She wondered. And besides, she was done with her mourning period, so she could remarry. Whose matter was it beside herself and Kuda's? She then shifted her thoughts to Kuda and found herself smiling fondly. She knew the young man had always liked her, even from the early days of her courtship with Ngoni, but he had always been respectful enough to keep his distance. Why now, though, did he want to marry her, a woman who had been married before, and not just married, but married to his best friend too? These thoughts continued to battle within her, and still she could find no way out. And still the days sped by, and soon enough the week had come to an end, with no resolution having been set in Tsitsi's heart and mind. Kuda arrived at Tsitsi's homestead a couple of days after their meeting. His heart too was in turmoil. He had already talked to the king to share his thoughts on marrying the widow of his best friend, and the king had been receptive. "I have no qualms with you marrying the young woman," the king had said. "Of course, people shall talk, but something will happen and their attention will shift again. So you are not to stress about what people will say, as long as the young woman agrees for you to marry her." But when he got to Titi's homestead, he saw the anguish in her eyes. He knew that perhaps it would not be the right time to talk about the marriage, so instead they sat and reminisced about Ngwani's life. Titi laughed and cried as she learned of the mischief that the boys had been up to as they had grown, stories that Ngoni himself had not gotten around to telling her. They talked of his dreams of leading the army and how those had been cut short, and they did not see the sun take a dip and the glorious majestic moon began its rise. They spoke like they had never done before as they ate the supper Titi had prepared for them. They spoke as Titi rocked her boy to sleep before she laid him on his bed. And still they had more stories to tell. Titi from over 2 years of loneliness, and Kuda from years and years of not being able to speak to women. He even had to admit to himself that she was the only woman besides his grandmother he had ever spoken so much to. And when, sometime in the middle of the night, there was a disturbance by Tsitsu's gate, a disturbance Tsitsu knew was her father, Kuda had rose and, yielding his weapons, walked out of the kitchen hut they sat in and shouted, "Who is it? Who dares try to break into this homestead?" Titi heard running footsteps receding into the night, and for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. She closed her eyes as she heard Kuda checking outside for more intruders, allowing herself to wonder if this was truly what she wanted. She adored Kuda, mostly as a brother-in-law. Sure, he was kind to her. He made her feel safe, made her feel seen, made her less lonely. Yet she knew it was not a spellbinding love, the same love she had had with Ngoni. But in her mind, she knew she liked Kuda as a person. Still with her eyes closed, she looked up into the roof and said, "Oh, Ngoni, please show me that by marrying your friend I will not be destroying your memory. Please." At that moment, Kuda walked into the hut. "Oh, clear," he said, coming to sit on the stool he had vacated when he had gone to the gates. But there was an excitement in his eyes as he thrust something under Tsitsu's nose. "Look what I found by the small gate that leads into the forest." Tsitsu took the object, which felt heavy in her hands, and looked it over and over again. She knew what it was. It was Ngoni's bracelet. He had had the goldsmith craft 2 bracelets for their wedding, with symbols of stars in them, for he had said, "You brought light in my path. You are my guiding star." He had gifted her one of the bracelets the night of the wedding, and he had worn one on his left arm and never removed it. When he passed, there had been no bracelet in his arm, and she had thought that perhaps he had lost it in the battle. Yet here it was, crusty from sitting in the elements of weather, but still golden and heavy. A tear fell out of her eye unbidden. Was this the sign from Ngoni? To be re-gifted the wedding bracelet by Kuda? Titi raised her eyes to look at Kuda, who was looking at her with adoration in his eyes. Then she smiled too, as resolve set in her heart before she said, "Yes, I will marry you." Kuda's eyes widened, and then he gave a woot of celebration which saw the baby staring, then settling again. Then he took Titi's hands in his and said, "Thank you, my love. I promise you that you shall forever be happy with me." Titi smiled, then said, "As long as we take things slow and we don't rush one another." Kuda nodded, and with patience and care and love, they built their home and had more children and lived with joy and happiness ever after. The end. Thank you once again for watching. I'm sorry for my voice. I've had a terrible cold and I'm sorry that it was breaking here and there. I appreciate all of you for coming here and watching my content. And if you like the story, please do leave some feedback in the form of a like or subscription or a comment. Love you long time. Bye.